Good. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Pat Harkin, How to Commit the Perfect Murder.
Good afternoon, thank you for coming. I'm going to make a small apology in advance. I'm going to have to keep referring to my notes because I haven't had a chance to actually learn this properly. But anyway, as it says on the slide, my name is Pat Harkin and the talk is How to Commit the Perfect Murder. So, before we begin, I want a quick bit of audience participation, but nothing too strenuous. I just want a quick show of hands. Who here has somebody in mind that they would quite like to get away with murdering? Spouse, lover, employee, you, someone who bid against them in the auction, sold them a Duff DVD. Yeah, a reasonable number there. Well, that's good. That's good. It's nice to know I have an attentive audience.
Does it count if they're in the audience?
I have to say some slightly bad news. Anybody who raised their hand is not ready for this talk. You need to go to my introductory class, Knowing When to Lie. Because otherwise you will plan your perfect murder, you will carry it out without a flaw, the police will come around and say, well, who do you think killed him? You'll say, me. I'm sorry, I thought you knew. So, no, you need to know when to lie. So, okay. So who am I, and why do I think I can deliver this talk? Well, although I now work in the world of academe, as a university administrator, I was for about 15 years a pathologist working for the NHS. Now, most of you, when you think of pathologists, you think of people like this. Nick Alexander, the Silent Witness, or Eve Lockhart from Waking the Dead, Ducky from NCIS, who Mr. Boggis here is convinced I am channeling. Those of us with long memories will remember. Takes you back. Look at his microscope. Look at that. That's how things work in the old days. Now, these people are all forensic pathologists. Okay, I was not a forensic pathologist, and I'll tell you now, even pathologists like me think forensic pathologists are a bit strange. So, what's the distinction? Well, this is a histopathologist, such as I was. This one's an American one. You can tell because he is wearing theatre scrubs while he is sat in an office. One of the many nice things about pathology is it's a 9-to-5 indoor sat-down job with no heavy lifting. You certainly don't need to go around trying to pretend you're a surgeon. But our job is mostly about diagnosing. If you get a mole that's growing or has a strange coloration, your dermatologist will cut it off, send it to a pathologist. If you have intractable heartburn, your gastroenterologist may send you for an endoscopy. They'll take a few pictures, they'll also take some little bits of tissue. They don't look at them themselves, they send them to his pathologist, we look at them, they end up on slides like this, we look them down our microscopes and we make our diagnoses. So the link to murder is almost accidental, it's a historical one in that this is, I would say, we say half the job, it's actually 95% of the job. The other 5% is running the hospital autopsy service. So histopathologists do mainly diagnostic work, but part of their time is running the mortuary, where we look for sometimes the cause of death, if it's not known why the patient died. More commonly, clinicians want to know whether the operation site had healed well, whether there was any infection, whatever. Clinicians have gone off autopsy recently. They're now really keen on scanners and CTs and MRIs, and they think they know it all, but to be honest, they don't. And if you ever die, you want an autopsy. Insist on it, so that you'll know what's going on. That didn't mean to go quite so fast forward there. So the hospitals run autopsy centres, but we don't get involved in most crimes. If somebody dies unexpectedly, a body is found, the case is referred to the local coroner. You all know what coroners' courts look like. Coroner's office is a very, very old office. It's originally derived from, as all great things in the British legal system are, the ability to collect taxes. And there was in the, I think it is the 1300s, the 14th century, a thing called the Great Ear, which was a travelling court, went round the kingdom, hearing arbitration disputes about taxation, inheritance, this sort of stuff. And it would take 7 years for this travelling court to go round the kingdom and come back to London. And as you can imagine, if you didn't have good bookkeeping over 7 years, people would forget who owned what. So the coroner was tasked with keeping track of all of this. And the coroner got into his interest in death because of inheritance and because of where a body was found might affect death duties and stuff like that, which is why coroners got into it. But they didn't really get into the actual determination of the cause of death until much more recently, except insofar as they were interested in whether some rich person had died of natural causes or had an accident or been murdered. It wasn't, in fact, until 1836 that coroners were allowed to ask for an autopsy. It is as recent as that. Coroner's Court, incidentally, is a very powerful court. Because it's very old, in law, generally speaking, the older something is, it takes precedent. And because of the relationship to money and taxation. And although it may have changed by now, I was taught when I was a student by my professor of forensics that if you get 2 court summonses for the same day, one to the Old Bailey, where the Prime Minister is being held on charges of treason and you're a material witness, and the other to the Lesser Snobbery Coroner's Court, where they're trying to decide whether a 25 quid ring dug up on the green is treasure trove or not. In theory, you should send your apologies to the Old Bailey. Because the Coroner's Court, the coroner, should he feel like it, has the right to send 2 policemen to pluck you bodily from the dock at the Old Bailey and take you to his court. Lovely idea. I've never seen it done in practice, but it's a nice idea. But so when coroners became more interested in determining the cause of death, they needed the facilities to do autopsies. Some cities would run their own mortuary, but given that the hospitals already had them, it's cheaper to buy in external services. So the health service sells our money to the court services, sells our services to the court facilities, and we do the autopsy and report back to them. So what that means is, if you are planning a murder, as long as you don't make it too obvious, if you shoot someone, if they are found with a knife in the back or whatever, even the slowest witted coroner is going to realise that there's something going on. They go straight to the forensic pathologist. They go straight to these guys. You don't want these guys on your tail. Once these guys, well, you've seen the programmes. You know once these guys are after you, you might as well just give up. If how many poor old guys dead now? But if Peter Falk ever knocked on my door, I would confess straight away. Just get out. But if you can make your death look non-suspicious, the coroner will ask the services of the hospital pathologist, and then you've only got to fool somebody like me. Shouldn't be that hard, should it? So, what is a perfect murder? What does that mean? I'm an academic. We love to define terms before we start talking about them. Murder is a legal concept, and definition varies from jurisdiction to jurisdiction, but in most places they split into 3 definitions: murder, manslaughter, and accident. The distinction between them being that murder is an intentional killing and has an element of intent. You intend to commit murder, you go out, you commit murder, blah, blah, blah. Manslaughter has a lesser degree of intent. So if, for example, I was a member of a rifle club, decided to do my target practice in the town square, on the grounds that I'm a really good shot, I'm always going to hit the target, and the target has a back door behind it, there's no danger, and I miss and I shoot someone. It's not murder because I didn't intend to kill anyone, but I think most people would say that that's not really an accident. I was culpable, and that would be classified as manslaughter or second-degree murder in some jurisdictions. And then at the bottom we have an accident. I go down to a properly maintained gun range, I fire at a target, and by a 1,000,000 to 1 chance, it ricochets off and kills the shooter next to me. It's not murder because I had no intention. It's not manslaughter, I wasn't being negligent, if that one was an accident. incidentally, without wishing to stray too far into legal matters, reasonably foreseeable, which is a phrase used a lot in accidents and manslaughter. Phrases like that are where lawyers really make their bread and butter, because they will use that leeway to try and make the jury agree with their interpretation of facts as opposed to opposing counsel. For which it follows that if you are reasonably intelligent people as you are, the law. Yeah?
In the shooting range one, would the owners of the shooting range be guilty of negligent homicide?
If there is an agreed standard for maintenance on shooting galleries, and they had held to it, then no. If, on the other hand, they were known, they knew that their back targets were getting full. I tried to go around the FBI headquarters shooting range in Washington a few years ago, and although I could see around the labs, we couldn't go down to the shooting range because it was being refurbished. The back wall was so full of lead, it was starting to shoot back. So they knew there was a problem, they were doing something about it. If they had not done something about it, then yeah. So in that case. So what I was saying, oh yes, reasonable doubt, reasonable, what's the phrase I use? Reasonable foreseeable. So if you are, as I hope you all are, reasonably intelligent people, it follows that the very last thing you want is a jury of your peers. You want a jury of malleable idiots that your suitably expensive lawyer can convince of his version of the facts. I suppose if you're innocent, you probably want an intelligent jury, but we are talking about committing murder here, so you don't want that. You want this very easy, convincible jury. Slight change of slide here. The number 3. Time for a drink. The number 3 has always fascinated the human mind. If you look at classic literature, Dumas wrote about the 3 Musketeers, and we will gloss over the fact that there are 4 of them and not a musket to be seen. Chekhov wrote about the 3 sisters. Shakespeare had 3 witches. In Greek mythology, Cerberus, the gates of Hades, has 3 heads, or possibly his 3 dogs stood one behind the other in this picture, but anyway, had 3 heads. The Apple of Discord was competed for by 3 goddesses, Hera, Aphrodite,
And Eris.
Eris. Eris threw the Apple of Discord. Athene.
Sorry.
And there were the 3 fates. Clotho, who spun the thread of life, Atropos, who measured its length, and Lachesis, who cut it short or long.
And the 3 Norns.
In children's literature, we have 3 pigs, Goldilocks and 3 bears, 3 billy goats, Gruff. It's always the 3rd brother who succeeds in the quest. And in music, we have the 3 tenors, 3 degrees, and Front Boy 3. We always split things into 3s, and we do the same in any criminal investigation into motive, opportunity, and method. Any particular favourites as to what we do first? Motive? Motive? Good, because motive's what I've got on my next slide. Motive is, in law, defined as a cause that moves people to induce a certain action. Now, you really want there to be no discernible motive for your murder. I hope that's relatively obvious. But it's quite tricky. There is going to be a connection between you and the deceased. If there isn't, why are you murdering?
Strangers on a train.
I will come back to that.
Serial killers.
Serial killers, again, are a special case, and we will come back to that. They really are very, very rare. Murder associated with other crimes is a separate issue. But anyway, I am a curmudgeonly old git, basically, who doesn't like people, but even I admire the fact that, on the whole, we don't go around killing strangers. It's a nice thing, don't you think, that we don't wander around
for charity.
killing people? Yes, for charity, of course. You've probably heard that most people are murdered by their relatives. This is not strictly true, because most people are not murdered.
Most people who are murdered by their relatives.
That's nearer the truth. These are actually figures for America, where the figures are a bit strange because there's an awful lot of robbery and drug-associated murder in America. But so you can see in '95, They had 8 murders per 100,000. We had just over 1. So hooray for us!
Yay! Well done, chaps.
We'll catch up soon.
The vast majority of the victims, and indeed most of the killers, are male and under 18 in the States. Under 18? It's staggering, isn't it? And in the States, over half of people are killed by a stranger. Now that's not the case for us. When you look at husband and wife, incidentally, the raw figures make it look like the women get quite a raw deal. 26% men, 3%. But that's actually sort of a delusional effect because of this enormous preponderance of male and young murder victims. And if you actually look at spousal murders, it's not 26-3, it's about 6-4. So it's still slightly more male to female, but yeah, you're making a blow for equality, ladies. You're getting a match towards 50-50.
Sorry, Pat, the victims are male and under 18. Are the perpetrators also under 18?
Yes. It's a young, violent country. It's gun crime. It tends to be the kids who don't know how to react, how to defuse a situation where it escalates, and it all goes pear-shaped. Incidentally, I grew up in Belfast, which is one of the few places in the United Kingdom where the people tend to be murdered by their relatives. Rule doesn't apply. In Northern Ireland, people generally didn't murder their relatives. If you were killed in Northern Ireland, it was usually a political thing or religious. And even having lived there, I don't quite understand the distinction between those two terms. But you know, on the bright side, if you were murdered in Northern Ireland, you knew you didn't have to feel bad about it because it was nothing personal. It was just one of those things. So there's usually going to be a link between you and the killer. Now, the police, outside fiction, can't talk to the deceased, but they can talk to relatives, to co-workers, and believe me, they do.
What's the comparative closure rate between, say, the US and the UK on murder?
I don't know is the answer. The vast majority in the UK are, well, somebody is found and convicted. Whether it's the right person, we sort of by definition can't be sure, but it's a high figure. Because nearly all our murders, there is a link for the police to follow. It's much easier for the police to take a small group of people and say, you are the one, rather than know there is a murderer out there and then try and find them. And the motive, the connection between people, reduces the pool of suspects, or at least concentrates it, and makes their job a lot easier. That's a principle that we'll come back to later when we're looking at evidence. So what I was going to say here. So yes, the police will talk to people. They will talk to people. We've just heard enormous numbers of people. So how are you going to stop them from finding out? Well, there's one option is what I call the Blackadder solution. Well, not a very good projection, I'm afraid. But if you've seen episode 1 of series 2, you know that when Blackadder wants to stop the world talking about how he feels for Bob, his manservant, he is told to kill himself, which he doesn't fancy, or to kill Bob, not too keen on either, or to kill everyone else. I have to say I don't recommend the Blackadder solution because all it does is it creates a lot of work for you. I mean, unless you have access to nuclear weapons or bioweapon arsenal or something, you're not going to manage to kill absolutely everyone. And then what happens is you are the only survivor, and you get asked questions like, why are you the only one not shot through the head?
Bit of a giveaway.
And then, you know, it goes downhill from there. So I don't go for that one. Now, you can, of course, try making things up with the deceased, but if you feel so badly towards them that you want to kill them, this is not something trivial. I don't know about you lot, but in my family there are people who are still not talking to Uncle Bob because of what he said about Cousin Jane at Auntie Sue's wedding back in 1984. And if families hold grudges like that over trivial matters, anything that's serious enough to lead to a murder is going to be big, and people are going to be suspicious that you're trying to make it up with a lifelong. So it's tricky to break that to get a connection. Now, you can, of course, try and conceal the fact that there's been a murder at all. You can try and make it look like the person is still alive. Now, in fiction, the standard way of doing this is, of course, you put somebody else in their place. Here are just some pictures I've picked off the internet, said to be doppelgangers. Katy Perry and Zooey Deschanel. Forgotten his name, he's an actor, James Blunt. Barack Obama and just some random American guy, really famous. Tina Fey and Sarah Palin. I think that's probably one of the best ones. But on the other hand, that is deliberate with makeup by professionals. But there is not one of those where anybody who has actually met the original is going to be fooled for a second. It's just not going to work. So you're not going to get away with that one. You might conceivably get away with murdering and replacing somebody the first day they've moved to a new town where they don't know anyone. But unless you're prepared to live in that new town as them for the rest of your life, you're going to have to go home eventually, and then people are going to notice that you've been away and they'll want to know where you are, the other guy doesn't come back, so on. I put this in merely to dismiss it. This is a Japanese roboticist called Hiroshi Ishiguro. I believe he's the one on the right, who has created what is thought to be the most human-like robot avatar available. Japanese are easily pleased, as all that. It's not going to fool anyone. It also can't get up and walk around, so it's all right for Skyping. Actually, on Skype you might get away with it if you cut the pixel width down. And it's also about £250,000. You do want to invest in one of these. So no, I don't fancy that. Another option is to make it seem like the victim has gone away. In the olden days, you might get away with somebody saying, you scribble a note, I have gone to lie low in Tuscany till the heat dies down. And the cost of sending a policeman or an oil painting of you or your victim to Tuscany, not that attractive, but of course today, a JPEG of your victim will be sent to the Italian authorities. Border control have logged his passport or your passport or whatever, and know that somebody has or has not left the country. That really doesn't work anymore. And as I say, it's said that it used to work. It is said that Arthur Conan Doyle sent this telegram to 5 of his, depending on which account you read, 5 of his acquaintances or 5 of his friends. I would say acquaintances myself. And the story is that they all left town that night. And that one never came back. Now, it might be worth trying that on your boss, or just a thought. It's a nice story. It is said about Arthur Conan Doyle. It's also said about several other people. I haven't been able to track it down 100%, but it was mentioned on QI, and it's good enough for Alan Davies. It's good enough for So, if you can't manage a disappearance, you're going to have to accept that there's going to be a body, and it's going to be dead, and it's going to be found. You can try and hide bodies. Again, I don't recommend it. Number of reasons. They're quite heavy and uncooperative. At best, they will strain your back, and at worst, they do have an interesting tendency to leak. Once the body has surfaced, the authorities are going to try and link it to you. They're trying to show that you and it were together at some time. They're going to look for what they call opportunity. So we're moving on from motive here. And an opportunity, here we go, a favourable, appropriate, or advantageous combination of circumstances would be phrased in the context of murder, isn't it? Advantageous or appropriate combination of circumstances to kill someone. Now, again, if you've watched any crime dramas, if you've read any crime books, you'll know that there is a basic scientific principle that when two things come in contact, trace evidence moves from one to the other. This is the guy who came up with it, Locard's transfer principle. Edmund Locard, he was the man who set up the Institute of Criminology at the Institute of Lyon. Can't remember exactly when, 1920s, I think. If anybody's read any of the Maigret books or remembers the TV series or the films, Jean Simenon, who wrote about Maigret, is known to have attended some of Locard's lectures.
Is it double jointed?
Do you know, I have no idea. Well, hang on. Yeah, Simenon was known to be double jointed. I mean, everybody knows that about it. Locard came up with this business of transfer of material and trace evidence. Fingerprints are a slight cheat to include in trace evidence because that's pretty much a one-way transfer. You leave your fingerprints behind. But what Locard said basically is that when two things come in contact, part of them is transferred to the other. So when you leave here today, material from your clothing will remain on these chairs, and some fibres from the carpet will go out on your shoes. If you go into your victim's office and have a row with him, you will go out with some of his DNA from his dandruff on your shoulders, and there will be some of your DNA in the spittle that you shouted at him. You can't avoid these traces. That said, trace evidence is nothing like as powerful as it's displayed on television. We've all seen dramas where they get a little scrap of fibre and they put it under the microscope, and the picture they show you looks as good as the stuff you get from one of those lenses you get in a Christmas cracker. And the scientist looks at it and says, ah, yes, 87% Belgian wool, 7% Carpathian wool, 60% nylon from recycled Korean badminton rackets. The shade is called white with just a hint of pretension and was only used in Honda Civics made in 1993. It was last trodden on by a man, 6'2", 140 pounds, brown hair, blue eyes, GSOH, non-smoker preferred. But it really, really, really doesn't work like that. Trace is very good at saying this person here was or was not associated with this site, this action, or whatever. So if you can show that the fibre found at the crime scene matches your hall carpet, that's interesting. But really there is no way they could take a fibre and know which hall carpets in Plymouth feature that fibre. It just doesn't work that way. It's a bit like, even DNA isn't that good. If a killer leaves a drop of blood at the scene of a crime and the police can find it, they can get DNA. What does that tell them? It tells them that the killer had DNA. And many killers do. But with no DNA phone book to look them up in, it's really no use at identifying a suspect. If you've got a possible suspect for other reasons, you can say that is or is not their blood. Having said that, you can do some things. From a sample of blood, you can tell male or female. And again, if you watch television, if you go to the films or whatever, they will try and tell you, you can say, oh yes, this is a Korean, this is an African American, or whatever. No, not really. At best, you can say, this piece of DNA includes a marker, 80% of which is found in African American populations. 20% of which isn't. And that's not really a good enough division to be actually useful for very much. There's a gene called G6PD, glucose 6-phosphatase deficiency, which, according to the books, is found purely in Afro-Caribbean stock. It's related to sickle cell disease. And the thing is, if you can get blood samples from some of the supposedly purest wasp stock in America, you will find G6PD, because DNA doesn't dilute. At any given split in the bloodline, you don't get half of it going each way. A gene either goes that side or it goes that side, and it is the same gene here as it was there. Which means if great-great-great-great-great-great-great-granddad had this gene, you can have it too. And that therefore means that this business of we can use this gene to identify bloodline and hence the style of our assailant really doesn't It's a bit like a lineup. DNA will help you pick your molecule out of your molecular lineup, just like recognition will pick a person out of a facial lineup. You've got to put the right people in the right to do it. So you're saying, here we have some examples of trace evidence. On the top left there, that's some cocaine on a $1 bill. Cheapskate, it's only a $1 bill, according to the notes. Below that, some fibres on a carpet at the top. Cigarette butt, from which of course you can extract DNA. Bottom, bottle of water. If you ask people to put an arrow on that diagram showing the flow of liquid, they'll all say it goes that way. It does. It also goes that way. If you've taken a sample, if you take a drink from a sample of water, your DNA from your saliva is in that water. If you shared a bottle of water with somebody, both your salivas are in that water. Just thought I'd mention that. Does anybody recognise this particular piece of trace? This is a particularly famous item. Skin? No? No? This is the piece of trace evidence which will enable the Martian authorities to sue NASA for littering. This is a bit of plastic that fell off the Mars Curiosity rover. There you go. Hundreds of millions of quid, hundreds of millions of miles, and bits fall off. They got awfully excited about it. They saw something shiny and they wondered what it was, and then they found it. So you probably think to yourself, well, if trace is so powerful, I better not leave any. That's not easy. On television, we see these guys go to investigate their crime scenes. Here we have David Caruso in his sharp business suit. Over on the left, the Las Vegas crew in their Las Vegas PD issue uniforms, shedding fibres, hair, DNA like buggery all over the place, completely ruining the crime scene. The bottom, same guys, well, same genre. At least they're wearing gloves, which is something. But nonetheless, horrible, horrible, horrible.
What does it protect that suit, do you?
Well, I was going to say, if you ever...
Midsummer Murders.
Hmm?
It's the one thing I like about Midsummer Murders.
Yeah.
You saw them wearing proper suits.
Why don't they switch the lights on when they go into buildings? I've always wondered that.
Two reasons. There could be a fingerprint on the switch, and the other is, unless you know that there isn't, for example, a gas leak, you don't want to go switching on any equipment. And not so much murder scenes, but
they never switch the lights on,
yeah,
any time.
It's protocol. I hesitate to bring up such an unpleasant subject, but paedophiles have been known to rig the light switch to degauss their hard drives.
Okay.
So the police walk in, flip the light switch, evidence is gone.
Okay. I just wondered.
Yeah, no, there is a reason for most of these things. But anyway, as we were saying, if you've ever watched a news broadcast coming to you from outside the crime scene, in the background you see these guys.
Yeah.
The giant Oompa Loompas. And as you see, they are covered head to foot as close as you can manage, just about. The guy on the left is from an advert, he doesn't, but anyway, you get the idea. The gloves, the masks, the all-over bodysuits. These things are designed to stop trace being left out. Even with these things in place, it is standard protocol that all members of the investigative team have their DNA and fingerprints on file for exclusion purposes, which might get you interested in that would be a reason for your DNA to be found at the scene, incidentally. And indeed, there is a whole genre of crime fiction based around that. A colleague of mine wrote one, it was Apologies for the murder. We thought he was famous. There you go. So, okay, well, you obviously think to yourself, well, I'll get one of these then. Well, you can't get them in Topshop. And it's going to show up on your credit card statements if you try and buy one. And they're not cheap. So you think, well, I'll get a painter's, decorator's coverall. No. Those things are designed to stop stuff getting onto you, not to stop you shedding stuff into the environment. And they shed fibres like any other piece of clothing. So the crime scene investigators will come along, take their fibres and go, ooh, somebody in a decorator's coverall has been here. I wonder who that was. And then, okay, they're not looking for necessarily a painter and decorator, but they know that you're trying to cover something. So it's you could, of course, manage. Let's go back one. You could, of course, not be on the scene by not being on the scene. Get somebody else to be there for you. We all know, supposedly, of somewhere in our own town where there's a pub, where in the back room there's a man who can solve your problem for you. Now, it's, of course, very difficult to know how true these stories are. If you have a hunt round, you will find lots of stories like this. Now, the major, those 5 I found were all from the Daily Mail. Maybe it's all from the Daily Mail, but then I did find one from abroad. But the thing about all of these is these are unsuccessful. Not only did they get caught, they got caught before the murder was committed because the person they hired did not go through with it, but turned them in. Okay, we can't know how often a perfect murder occurs and never gets detected, but we do know that trying to hire a contract killer is not safe. And if you do find somebody who's willing to take your money, what if they're not the right sort of criminal? What if they're not the murdering kind? What if they're the stealing kind? Who just take your money and go? What are you going to do? You're going to go to the police and turn them in? Yes, citizens advise if you're a small claims court. I suppose I'm not sure at that point how serious your crime is, because you are allowed to plan murders. It's only the execution, pardon the phrase. That's what gets the authorities upset. But anyway, it probably isn't as predictable, because remember, hopefully you're only going to do this once. So you want something that's going to work. You don't want something that works 9 times out of 10. You want a good, reliable case. So it's like that. So, having therefore said that it's going to be very hard to conceal your opportunity, let's have a look at some methods. Mode of operating, or the means of obtaining an object. Objective, I should say. Now, I told you at the beginning what a murder was, but I never said what a perfect murder was. I'm going to take my definition, with some change, from the aviation industry, where they say a good landing is one you can walk away from. Perfect landing is one where you get to reuse the plane. There we go. My mum, incidentally, once decided that she wanted to learn to fly, and she got a book from the library. And the chapters were laid out in sort of sequence order, weather planning, route planning, takeoff, flight. She got to the chapter on landing. She's about 3/4 of the way through the book. And the chapter opens, let's face it, every landing is basically a controlled crash. She shut the book and she took it back to the library, and that was it. But anyway, so I'm going to say that a good murder is one which resists investigation. Perfect murder doesn't get investigated in the first place because it doesn't get recognized as murder. So we now need to look at methods. We've decided that there's going to be a body, it's going to be found. You don't want the authorities to get suspicious. So you want it to look like something that's not a murder. You need to find some way of killing your victim and making it look like something else, and something that's not suspicious. There's no point in making a stabbing looking like a shooting. That really doesn't help. It's a nice intellectual challenge, but it's not really going to help keep you out of jail. So we won't bother with that. Now, there are various ways, if you read the books, about avoiding detection. This is, I think, the goriest picture I've got. So it's not very gory, it's just, there is that. And I include it because, I read in a crime novel some years ago what the author was trying to propose was a method of avoiding detection. In an autopsy, I said this was the goriest picture, I didn't say it was the goriest word. In an autopsy, the first incision runs down the neck, down the midline, peel back the skin, and then you put a knife up under the chin, run it round inside the jaw to free the tongue trachea windpipe dissection outwards. So, the theory proposed by this author goes, if you could inject into the lingual vein here, when the pathologist sticks his knife up and does that, he'll destroy the evidence for you. See? No needle mark to be found. Two problems. Firstly, it assumes that we only look for needle marks. Well, it assumes we only look for needle marks on the outside of the body. We actually don't. And as I say, you always look under the tongue as you cut, because otherwise you end up sticking the knife in your fingers, because your fingers are in there. Sorry about that.
And you have to convince someone to sit still while
I was about to come to that. If you can convince someone who has no reason to trust you, it's not just any old person. If you can convince somebody to sit still while you inject them in the lingual vein, you know. You're wasted murdering people. You should be running Mission Impossible force, convincing Russian mafia to shoot each other and give you all the money. So that's not going to work. But we need something else. Now, people die of natural causes every day. There are infections. Most infections are relatively slow, and we do have a health service. Most infections are treatable. People have heart attacks and strokes. They're faster, but very hard to fake. Very hard to actually give somebody a stroke. You can attempt to infect somebody with it. It's very hard to give them a stroke. Cancer is a common killer, but by God, you'd have to be patient with me to irradiate somebody and then wait 20 years. So, you know, that's...
I think it makes the HIV, you know, you get child injecting HIV into the victims, and I don't know what the base, but I mean, again, it's the same sort of thing, plus the fact, if you know it, you can get the drugs in quick and you can offset it all.
Yes.
And you'd have to do it quite a large amount as well.
You have to, well, and it takes a long time.
Yeah.
So, and it is regarded as grievous bodily harm, but it's not attempted murder. Well, I suppose it would be attempted murder if you specifically got a syringe of blood.
So, the conspiracy theory that AIDS was an invention perfected by the American military using green monkey disease from the Congo to drop on the Vietnamese so that they had no immune system.
Yeah.
It just would take far too long to actually take effect.
There's two problems. One is that the time scale is
That's what I mean, yeah.
balmy, and the other is it assumes that the American military are competent.
What about something like tuberculosis?
What about something like tuberculosis?
I mean, because people ignore coughs a lot of the time, and a recurring cough is one of the warning signs of tuberculosis.
True.
So
how would you propose to infect somebody with tuberculosis?
Well,
this is the problem. You need your method.
You need the tuberculosis bacillus.
Tuberculosis is a serious infection. It's less serious than it was 50 years ago, but more serious than it was 10 years ago as resistant drug strains or resistant strains of the bacterium are emerging. But it is still mainly treatable. It's really quite unusual to die of TB. It's, apart from anything else, it's a slow condition. You're requiring doctors to miss it for 10 years, but it is still something that we think about. And we have sort of standard protocols, coughs that go on without responding to antibiotics for a certain period of time, send off some sputum for TB culture and...
or rabies.
Rabies, it would be very hard to make the death from rabies in this country look like natural causes because we don't have it.
No.
You could. Last case in Britain was 1978. Child, I think, returned from... Oh yes, yes, so there was one recently. But again, it was acquired abroad.
Yes, they've just come back.
But, you
So
know,
it's possible.
If your target is, say, wintering in southern Spain or southern France, because they're old and you want their money, which is one of the main motives, then it would be easier if one was able to get hold of a rabid creature.
So, well,
carefully.
simply get hold of the rabid creature. Convince convince it to bite your victim while you are not there, otherwise the victim will say, she held the bloody squirrel at me throat. It's theoretically possible, but I don't see it working. Well, that's the other thing. You've now got a cross squirrel and a cross person on your hands. There are better ways, which we might come back to later.
Drop
if
next
I
to
learn to trust you.
Give them the sandwich infected with botulism.
That's actually not a bad one. Not in the UK so much. America, yes, very much so. The home bottling industry is the drawback is that where things are common, the local medics are used to looking for them. So you might well get away with botulism here. In terms of getting away with, or at least the diagnosis not being made in time to save your victim. But then we have somebody in Plymouth who has died of botulism. That's a bit strange. Environmental health will be looking into it. Where did the botulism come from? And then potentially there's a link to you. That's what we're trying to avoid.
Ah, but
we're trying to avoid
what
links.
you do is you nip round and you dent a few of the cans in the larder at the same time.
You're meant to be expanding then.
I've
You've been thinking about
put it this way, I've been eating dented cans for 50 years and I ain't got botulism yet. I think this is an old wives' tale. Modern cans are not like the old cans. The way the walls are made, the linings are different and the dent doesn't break the seal. So I don't think we need to worry about that. What was I talking about now? Yeah, so one possibility would be an accident. Industrial accidents, quite spectacular. I slightly have the advantage that your murder is lost among all the others. So if you are prepared to kill all 300 workers in a factory to avoid detection, well, it might work. The drawback, of course, is that places that are capable of blowing up like this or whatever are dangerous places. So you, who don't know what you're doing, have got to get in, sabotage it, and not kill yourself in the process. It's a lot of work. It's probably not going to be easy to do. Not impossible, but possible.
I can think of one place that you could kill probably 50 or 60,000 people. Berkeley Water Treatment Works carries something in the region of 100 tons of liquefied chlorine.
Yes.
I know exactly where it is.
But what I'm saying is, you've got a large number. Are you prepared to murder this number of people?
If you're going for one, you may as well go for the whole thing.
I shall always think of you as Madame Bolshevik.
Madam Genocide.
But anyway, if we
that way you get lost in the numbers.
not all accidents happen at work.
How did they do that?
They're mating.
How you get Honda Civics.
When a mummy Honda Civic in a
The drawback, as you probably worked out here, all these accidents involved another vehicle, which presumably has got you in it. So you are running a major risk of killing yourself, and of course you, who have a motive to murder, let us say, the biker, were the driver of the car. And the police, again, are not as easily fooled as they used to be. You could try tampering with vehicles. We've all seen films where the brake cables are cut in the car, careers down the hill, because they're always driven by stupid people who don't know that the gears can be used to slow a car, and that you also have a handbrake. And with modern cars, in fact, my car is so paranoid, if you cut the brake cables, it just wouldn't start. I mean, I suspect it won't start if the ashtray gets full. I call it Beaker. My car's called Beaker because it's got a parking sensor. And as you get closer to things, it beeps, get closer together and higher in pitch, it goes beep, 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 So, accidents are going to be a bit of a problem. Now, hopefully, the the cunning among you are all thinking poison.
Having something in the gas tank. Not that they run on nitroglycerin, as is seen in Hollywood. But if you had a dissolvable agent that increased the flammability
Yeah.
with say something that just set a spark.
Well, gas tanks don't blow up. I refer you to Mythbusters, where they spent bloody ages trying to get gas tanks to blow up. You need oxygen and vapour. And a gas tank is full of gasoline vapour, or sorry, a petrol tank is full of petrol vapour. There's not enough oxygen to actually sustain a fire. So it's not going to work. Anyway, and also if there is an accident, the police, if there is a death, if there had been a death in any of these scenes, every single one of these vehicles would have been taken away for detailed examination. Because they will want to see that this was caused by a failure in the steering linkage. So that they can go back to the manufacturers and say, this is a hazard. So anything you do to change a car is going to get spotted.
I had a friend once who had a car serviced and they didn't do the bolts on the engine up properly.
Me too.
And
Well, it wasn't the engine, it was just the steering. So I was driving home and suddenly I only had one wheel that turned.
no, she had the
AA man went
engine
white. He
edge
said,
back
you could have been killed.
Mm.
But, you know, it would have been discovered that there was no nut on the end of the bolt that held the thing to the other
But
thing.
if you just had your car serviced,
Yeah.
then
Oh, well, that's the most dangerous time to go driving, where you just had some idiot working at your car.
yeah, but then the thing is that then the lens of examination is pointed at the people who service the car, not at you.
Well, again, you've got to make sure that your crime works first time, because if there are two near misses, that looks very suspicious. Nobody's going to believe that twice.
I also think, when they say about the conspiracy theories about Princess Diana, I think, well, hang on a minute, all it would have taken was for her to put on her seatbelt.
Yes.
That's not a reliable method in the slightest.
They say Camilla went to the Queen and said, you and Philip have been together all the time. What's the secret of a long and happy marriage? Always wear your seatbelt. Don't piss me off. So anyway, we were about to move on to poisons. Now, you may not know that before he went into Top Gear, James May was a 15th century physician, and I'm going to look up his name because it is so wonderful. He called himself Paracelsus, but his full name, or the name he was born with, was Philippus Areolus Theophrastus Bombastus von Hohenheim. Mr. Bombastus. He was a physician, as many people were in those days. He did a little bit of all sorts of things. He was a physician, a botanist, an alchemist. He was an occultist and astrologer. I find the astrology bit very interesting because his birthday was either the 11th of November or the 17th of December, and nobody seems to know. And you'd think if he was into astrology, he'd have written it down somewhere. But anyway, there we go. He was a bit of a self-publicist. Paracelsus means the equal or greater than Celsus, a Roman physician whose teachings had held sway for the previous 1,500 years. They had been accepted without question. But when I say accepted without question, they were wrong in many places. People would go to an anatomy class, dissect a body, the instructor at the front would read out what Paracelsus had said, and the students would write down in their books what Paracelsus said they could see. So he said the liver had 4 lobes. So everybody writes down, liver has 4 lobes. Liver has 3 lobes. Dog liver has 4 lobes. And that's presumably where Celsus got his idea. So
actually, where it comes from is the church, because Galen practiced primarily on animals and based a lot of his research.
He did. Galen was a physician in the arena.
Yes.
And although he wasn't allowed to do autopsies or dissect bodies, he was allowed to have a poke around at anybody who was a bit open while he was stitching them up. So that's where some of our basic anatomy comes from.
But Galen did actually go on to be an army surgeon as well. And
but again, you're not allowed to do proper autopsy.
No.
And that's where you really he was a bit of a self-publicist. If you look at the title at the bottom of the picture there, I'm thinking of changing my university name badge to say the famous Dr. Harkin. That's what he says at the bottom there. And some people think that the adjective bombastic is derived from his name of Bombastus. Sadly, the Oxford English Dictionary doesn't agree.
Oh.
That's a shame. But why I brought Paracelsus up is that he said, he said it in German, which probably sounds a lot more impressive. Poison is in everything, and no thing is not a poison. It is the dose which determines the poison. So, all the things that you take as medicines in large doses will kill you. And the things that you think of as poisons, cyanide, weed killer, whatever, in small quantities, won't kill you. So he got something right. It's actually getting very hard to find decent poisons these days. When I was a lad, 90% of the... Have you actually tried to buy copper sulfate?
I've got half a pound of it sat in my kitchen. We get it from our local farm shop.
Farms are a strange place. The regulations on poisons in farming communities are very different, but given that farmers have access to industrial machines and shotguns, you know, a little bit. But for example, paraquat. Yeah.
I had no problem buying 1 kilogram copper sulfate. For work.
For work.
Yeah.
I tried to buy some the other week. No, the other month now.
It's not even on secure chemicals.
Yeah.
If you want some, let me know.
Fiona, what's your cut though? How much percentage?
You've got to remember, you're talking to the man who was sat minding his own business at work one day when the phone rang and the voice in the room says, "Hello, Terry here. Can you get hold of some arsenic?" Maybe. What do you want it for? And it was moderately innocent, but anyway.
Sorry.
I said, when I was a kid, just about everything under the sink was horrible, fatal stuff. But just about anything you go and buy in your supermarket these days has been replaced down the years. Paraquat, which when I was a junior house officer, which is only 100 years ago.
Yeah, you try and get full reserve down afterwards.
Yeah. It causes pulmonary fibrosis and you die. The stuff that you can still buy paraquat in some garden supply places, but it's so weak that it's non-toxic. Farmers can still get the good stuff. But as I say, well, I must admit I haven't tried recently, but they still could last I checked.
That's the only shit that's
Sorry? Is it now banned? All right. Well, I'm obviously behind the times.
What about
Right.
things like root outs?
Well, things like what? Sorry.
Root outs.
Caustic materials.
Yeah.
Acids and alkalis are surprisingly easy to get hold of.
Oh yeah, you can buy hydrofluoric.
But the
That's really fun.
Yeah, but again, the problem is, how do you administer it to your victim without it being obvious that it was you? Something that's going to act that quickly is going to be a problem. Because you're on the scene. You've got to do it. It's very hard. It's not impossible. It's very hard to organise that sort of poison.
I have a question then, because in a way it's poisons. Coma. Because they obviously they induce coma by a momentary thing of carbon dioxide into the body. Now that was done.
Who's they? Sorry, in this context.
The villains or whatever.
Oh right.
So they had obviously a switch that they switched so that the momentary flows that then starve the brain.
Oh yes, that coma. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's bollocks.
And you know you can't crawl through those things. That
Yeah, I know.
Yeah.
But so if you actually had an operation going, saying how you would actually administer it, okay, you'd need someone with a spyglass or, as you say, in the ventilation ducts. They knew at that moment.
I think the practicalities of it are incredibly difficult because, in essence, what you're trying to do is suffocate someone just enough, and it would be hard enough to do if you were actually there. With a pillow, able to monitor, as opposed to down in the basement of the hospital twiddling knobs. So I really think it would work. And the other thing is, I think we'll come back to this later, some poisons, and carbon monoxide is one of them, have telltale signs.
Yeah, no, what I'm meaning is the telltale signs were there, but if you managed to say you were twiddling the knobs,
oh, right, yeah.
the surgeon would be the one that's investigated, not actually you. So if you had someone in the... Yeah.
Or
well, somebody would want, well, the thing is, there is no carbon monoxide supply in most hospitals, so you know you need to, it would be traced back.
Yeah, I was just trying to think if you could shift the blame. See what I mean?
Oh, there are various ways. I'm trying to think of something that's as safe for you, at least, as possible, if not for your victim. So to minimise the chances of detection. And it is hard to get decent poisons. You've probably come across these lovely little fellas. These are poison arrow frogs. So you might think, well, I'll raise a couple of them. These guys exude a toxin in their mucus, which is so poisonous it would kill you to pick one up. The people who use the mucus on their arrows in the jungle are experts at catching these guys without touching them. And I say that with confidence because the ones who aren't experts don't do it for very long. You know, it's like anybody can juggle chainsaws once. There are a couple of drawbacks. First of all, where are you going to get one of these and not have anybody know that you've got one of these? Is the
What
first
about cane
objective.
toads?
Where would you get? The cane toads are not particularly poisonous.
I thought the stuff on their back was...
It's psychotropic, but it's not that poisonous. These guys are intensely poisonous.
Oh, yeah.
Or rather, these guys aren't intensely poisonous. You can keep these in captivity. You don't need a license because they're not poisonous in captivity. They don't actually make poison. The flies that they eat in their natural habitat contain a toxin that they secrete in their mucus. But if you feed them on mealyworms and grubs or whatever that you feed frogs on in captivity, they're not poisonous. Dave Hayden taught me that.
So you actually want the frog?
Hey, that could be a good story. Somebody who got it wrong.
Yeah? Why aren't you dead? Why should I be? Why poisonous?
Supply those flies to edible frogs. If your proposed victim was French.
I don't know if it works. I just don't know. I am
Because
not
I'm just telling you.
That's not my
I'll
field.
tell you afterwards the story I heard.
Yeah. So you want to choose your poison with care. We mentioned carbon monoxide. A lot of poisons have giveaway features. Picture on the top left, not a terribly good picture, but the best I could find. If I look around the room, I should probably be able to spot people with dark hair and blonde roots, or grey roots. So you see some walking down the street. It's quite a common phenomenon. What you don't see very often is people with grey hair and black roots. But you do if you poison somebody with thallium.
I was thinking that.
It makes all their hair fall out, but as it does, it gets dark at the roots. So it's not a terribly good photograph, but that chap's got dark roots and pale hair. This fella here has been poisoned with lead, giving these grey-blue lines in the gums. These, incidentally, are not homicide poisonings, these are industrial poisonings. Down at the bottom there, if you poison somebody with, let me think, it's turpentine, their urine will smell of Parma violets. It's not usual clinical finding. And if you poison somebody with aspirin, their breath will smell of nail polish remover.
What about iron?
Iron?
I know it's toxic in high levels.
It is, but by heck, you've got to be patient. The patient will eventually die of cirrhosis, and we are talking years.
Or
I mean, if you're a, we are assuming you're a murderer, so you probably are a bastard. But generally speaking, you don't get the instancy of revenge, and a liver transplant is no joke, but it would be curative.
It depends how you administer the iron. If you administer the iron by an axe.
Refer you back to the trace evidence.
Yeah. Now
You've got an alibi.
again, if you watch TV, if you go to the films, you will hear about traceless, tasteless poisons, cheap, easily available, easy to administer.
Find them on eBay.
Suffering, well, yeah, I came proud. Suffering only from one tiny drawback in that they don't exist.
Excuse me, how about radon gas?
Again, it's not very, chemically it's inert. No, I wouldn't.
That somebody's living in the area. You just
Well, I mean, the people who are.
maybe an isotope.
Having decided that the cirrhosis from the iron is too slow, by heck radon's going to be too slow. It's going to be too imprecise. You could get away with, basically it's radiation poisoning. The gas itself is inert, chemically inert. And we know that polonium kills people, and if they think to look for it, they trace it back to the country that it originated from. It's not going to work. Apart from anything else, we're going to get hold of some radon gas and not have anybody know.
Pockets of it around, quite a lot of pockets of it around.
Well, there are. How do you get them? You have to go and drill, and it takes a heck of a lot of purification. Purification of inert gases is... you're not going to do it in the kitchen and get enough radon to kill someone.
I was thinking
so you'd have to buy it.
Of something where, if one had the means...
Even if you put someone who makes someone live in an area where there are high levels of radon,
they already
do. Cancer levels go up a bit, but not enough to be a decent murder weapon.
Could you use something like radon in somebody's house?
I'd
to
use
masquerade, to mask another radioactive substance which was more deadly.
No, because if you will not kill somebody with the radiation from radon. It's just not going to happen. So if somebody dies of bone marrow failure from radiation toxicity, they're going to look for the other radiation source.
I'm just trying to be creative.
Your best bet is to get them to
So,
collect smoke detectors.
Undetectable poisons. Nothing is really undetectable if a chemist has a reason to go looking for it. We don't have Dr. McCoy's medical tricorder that could just go. That will just go. There are no poisons here, Jim. Just as we don't have his medical scanner, like that little thing there. Incidentally, trivia question: anybody know what these things were actually? Salt cellars. Yeah. Fairly obvious when you look at the damn thing, isn't it? Anyway, we don't have those. We're getting there. The thing on the right, you could go out and buy tomorrow. That particular one, it won't go. There are no poisons. That one will go. There is no anthrax here. Just sniffs the air. By changing the sensor block on top, it's a cartridge-based system. It can have. It's an electronic nose. It can look for lots of specific things. But like I said earlier, picking things out of a trace evidence is good for picking things out of a restricted arena. So you can say there is no blah 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 here. You can't say what poison is here. The question doesn't work that way around. The one at the bottom there is called the smart pill. You swallow that and it takes photographs of your inside and uploads them straight to your Facebook page. But probably does by now, actually.
Elementary, my dear Watson.
Oh dear, that's fun.
There was one set of American murders that was traced back to the National Hospital. The woman was purposely baked and confused with, I don't know, some poison in husbands. I think they got to the second one. She's committed one successful murder and possibly
Got greedy. I'll be coming back to a case like that later. So I was going to say, yes, if you do want to poison someone, you want one where the symptoms that there will almost inevitably be make it look like natural causes. Now, I think somebody knows what this is. There is a poison which is effective, fairly easily available, cheap, tastes sweet, so you can put it in food without too much of a problem, and it resists the heat and chemical processes of ordinary cooking and baking, unlike most biological poisons. Somebody's already said what it is. Arsenic. Anybody who's not seen Arsenic and Old Lace is missing a treat of a film. Anybody seen it?
Yeah. Oh, of course.
Brilliant. Of course you have. Of course you have.
Double taking.
Now, arsenic, there are some drawbacks to arsenic. You have to be willing to take a bit of a gamble. Firstly, you need access to your victim over a long period of time. You need to administer small doses repeatedly. If you give somebody enough arsenic to kill them in one go, you'll make them sick. Now you may think, I'm trying to kill them, I'm sicker. I mean, you'll make them vomit. So they take it down, they come back up, they don't die, and you lose your game. So you need access over a period of time. But if you do that, it's very handy in that it mimics the features of gastroenteritis. Now, gastroenteritis is common, and it does occasionally kill people. Not often, but it does happen. The drawback to arsenic is that it doesn't rot, it doesn't decay. I am aware of a case very like the one you were mentioning, happened in a hospital a few miles from where I work. A woman was admitted with gastroenteritis, and she deteriorated despite treatment, and she died. Very sad, but these things happen. Physician wrote up the cause of death, gastroenteritis, funeral went ahead, no problems. And a couple of years later, the guy had remarried, and his second wife was admitted to hospital with gastroenteritis. Different physician, same hospital, but different physician. She deteriorated, she died. Physician, quite happy to believe this was gastroenteritis, was about to write up the death certificate, when one of the other relatives just happened to say how terribly unlucky this poor man was to lose not just one wife to gastroenteritis, but two.
And three is
that
just
point,
careless.
Suspicious alarm bells started ringing. The body was sent for an autopsy. To the naked eye, and indeed down a microscope, gastroenteritis. Because it was gastroenteritis, it was a chemical gastroenteritis, as opposed to an infective one, but they look the same. But our chemists were able to detect large quantities of arsenic throughout the body.
Ah.
So,
But if you had the remains cremated and then scattered the ashes,
I don't know how much of the arsenic boils off in cremation, but it'll still be in the ashes if you know where the ashes have been scattered.
yeah, but if you say scatter the ashes
True.
at sea.
Oh yeah,
You're not
yeah.
allowed to scatter at sea, it's illegal, isn't it?
Oh,
I don't know.
I remember a priest saying to me that it is illegal, you cannot scatter at sea,
Oh,
but it kind of goes on
I
unofficially.
think you can get permission to do
Yeah, or I went up their favourite mountain and
Anyway,
scattered them into
we'll return to how to dispose of scattering ashes in a minute. In this particular case, the original body was exhumed. And when they opened the coffin, the body was surprisingly well preserved. Because arsenic is toxic to bacteria and the normal degrading enzymes in human tissues. It slows decay. And that body was full of arsenic as well.
Which of course is the case with Napoleon Bonaparte.
No.
The story bounces back and forwards about whether the wallpaper did or did not.
No, yeah,
But
they
yes,
said,
the
but the body was
the
inspired.
problem with arsenic, looking in bodies from that long ago, is that there was so much arsenic in the everyday environment that everybody had some arsenic in it. And the thing about an autopsy is it doesn't tell you what somebody died of. It tells you what they had when they died. Now sometimes you can say, normal complement of heads, 1. This complement, none.
Something's wrong.
Probably blood loss. For example, I am about to shoot you. The fear of seeing the gun gives you a heart attack, and I do shoot you. The pathologist will find a bullet wound and a myocardial infarction. What kills you? But it depends entirely on how good your lawyer is. That boils down to that one. So, where are we going? Arsenic. So, we started out looking at our three-legged stool of motive, opportunity, and method. We decided that motive was going to be very hard to conceal, particularly the sort of motives that would lead you to murder as opposed to just like a bit. You know, I let these tires down. We looked at opportunities, trace evidence these days, and the amount of resource that police are willing to put into a murder investigation being that opportunity, bit of no-go. That's just left us with method, and despite some spirited discussion and some good suggestions from the room, I don't think we've come up with anything that I would regard as infallible. I'm afraid method has gone out of it as well. And I think I have to say that my final conclusion is that there is no way to reliably commit perfect murder. That is not to say there is no way to commit murder and get away with it, but I think you have to accept that you will be taking enormous risks if you plan one. If you are thinking, but I'm clever, I can think of something. My brain will get me out of this problem. I will just give you one piece of advice from ancient Chinese civilization, which I think should always stand you in good stead. Beware of your head. It will get you into trouble, and I would much rather you took the advice of Bill and Ted. Excellent to each other. Thank you.